Six Flags Great America is home to one of the strongest collections of roller coasters in the Six Flags chain. Boasting an impressive 15 coasters, there's really something for everyone there. But what stands out as the best of the best? Here are my top 10 coasters at Six Flags Great America. Before we get into the top 10 though, let's first take a look at the coasters that didn't quite make it into the list. Starting off, we have the Little Dipper. This is a small wooden family coaster made by PTC. It's been operating in the park since 2010, but it originally opened in 1950 at the now defunct Kiddieland Park. There isn't too much to say about the layout. It's a very standard figure 8 design. The reason this ride is at the bottom of the list isn't because I have any problems with the actual ride, rather the operations. The operations on this ride are dreadful and managed to make the wait for this coaster comparable, or in some cases longer, than the wait for the major coasters in the park. This is one of only 2 rides in this park that I go out of my way to avoid riding whenever I'm there. The other one is the Dark Knight coaster. Not to be confused with the other much better Batman themed coaster in the park, the Dark Knight coaster is an indoor Mack Rides Wild Mouse coaster. I absolutely loathe Wild Mouse coasters. I find them to be super rough and painful. This one takes that up a notch though and puts the ride in almost complete darkness, meaning you won't be able to brace for any of the abrupt movements. I will give Six Flags credit though for the theming in some parts of the queue. When I rode, the pandemic was still in full effect, so they had a lot of the theming elements in the queue, like the pre-show, disabled, but it does look really cool. Next up on the list, we have the Sprocket Rockets. This is your standard Vekoma family coaster. There isn't anything too noteworthy on this ride, but it's a great coaster for families with children that are just a little too short for the bigger coasters in the park. One of those bigger coasters is the Demon, which is next on this list. The Demon is a custom looper from Aerodynamics, which opened with the park in 1976. Unfortunately, this coaster is really starting to show its age, being one of the rougher coasters in the park. The layout is very simple. That being said, old aero coasters like this do have a certain charm to them. While it does feel a little out of place compared to the newer coasters in the park, it would be really disappointing to see it removed. It's not necessarily a roller coaster that I ride every time I go to the park, but it is a fun piece of history. Its theme song also kinda slaps.
Have you ever heard him scream? Is the demon what he seems?
The final coaster to talk about before we get into the top 10 is the Joker. The Joker is an SNS 4D free spin coaster, which means that you're freely flipping throughout the course of the ride. I do find these rides to be enjoyable, however, because of how common they are, and because sometimes they feel more like flat rides than coasters, it's hard to include them on the top 10. Speaking of the top 10, we've made it to number 10, Flash Vertical Velocity, or as it was formerly known, V2. This is a standard intimate impulse coaster, and because of that, the layout is incredibly simple. The ride cycle consists of launching forwards and backwards throughout 2 vertical spikes. These spikes reach a max height of 185 feet. While the ride is definitely simple, it is still quite fun. Coming in at number 9 is the American Eagle. The American Eagle is a dueling out and back wooden coaster made by Intamin. As a fun fact, this was actually Intamin's first major coaster project. This ride is massive. However, it is somewhat difficult to appreciate the scale of this ride because of how tucked into the back of the park it is. It's so far into the back that it's almost hard to find. The queue for this ride takes you on an absolute journey, but that journey is worth it once you get to the ride. For me, the highlight of this coaster is the massive helix about halfway through the layout, but there's also some solid airtime moments throughout the rest of the ride. Unfortunately, this ride is in need of a retracking as it has gotten quite rough over the years. Not rough enough to make the ride fun, but rough enough that if you were to ride this multiple times in a row, you'd pretty much be guaranteeing you'd get a headache. Number 8 on the list is the Whizzer. The Whizzer is another opening day attraction, but unlike the Demon, the Whizzer has aged fantastically. The way this coaster uses the terrain makes it stand out from the rest of the rides in the park. Throughout the layout, you are constantly going between trees, over water, and right up next to the ground. That being said, the layout isn't the strongest in the park, and it is sort of lacking the forces that typically go along with Schwarzkopf coasters. It's not the biggest deal in this case, and the Whizzer makes for a great ride for the whole family. Number 7 is the Viper. The Viper is an in-house built mirror of the famous Coney Island Cyclone roller coaster. There isn't much that needs to be said about the Viper. It is your classic wooden roller coaster. It does have a little bit of roughness in some spots, but overall, it's just a really fun ride. Another ride that's just fun is Batman the Ride, which is number 6. This is the original B&M invert, which means that you actually ride underneath the track. This ride is actually insane. The amount of forces you pull during this ride ride is absurd. Batman has one of the strongest and most intense layouts in the entire park, and the only reason it's not higher is because of how popular this ride model is. There's currently 11 coasters operating with this exact same layout around the world. Unfortunately, that makes this ride feel less unique, and therefore it gets a lower ranking on this list. One thing that this Batman has that the others don't is the fact that it actually has interesting terrain around it. Unlike the other Batman coasters that are just on a flat plot of land, this Batman actually interacts with the surrounding terrain because it was designed for this terrain. But with that, we've reached the top 5. These are the best of the best coasters in this park. Starting off the top 5 is Superman. This is a B&M flying coaster, which means that you are actually laying down while you ride. This ride simulates flying with large swooping elements, and because of that, the ride is not generally the most intense, except for one part. Right after the drop, you go into what's known as the pretzel loop. This element is absolutely insane, and it's the reason I return to this ride every time I'm at the park. Another ride that I return to every time I'm at the park is X-Flight, which is number 4 on this list. There was a point in time where X-Flight was my favorite roller coaster ever, and while over time it has gone down my list, it is still one of my favorites in the park. Every element it takes is just so enjoyable and so fun. I know a lot of people aren't the biggest fans of wing coasters because they are generally forceless, and this ride isn't an exception to that. But a ride doesn't necessarily need to be forceful to be fun, and this ride proves that. A ride that is forceful is Max Force, which is number 3 on this list. This is the newest coaster on this list. Opening in 2019, Max Force is an S&S air launch coaster. This ride has an impressively long ride time of a whopping 23 seconds, but it does a lot with that time. In that time, it manages to pack in 5 inversions and a top speed of 78 miles an hour. It gets to that speed thanks to the most insane launch I have ever experienced. Using compressed air, you're launched from 0 to 78 miles an hour in 1.8 seconds. This launch is so intense that it happens faster than you can process it. And that stays true throughout the rest of the ride. You blaze through the ride so fast that when you hit the final brake run, you need to take a moment to figure out what just happened. Getting second place is Goliath. Goliath is a RMC wooden topper track coaster, which is currently the fastest wooden roller coaster in the world, hitting a max speed of 72 miles an hour. This ride is the definition of short but sweet. Every element in Goliath's layout is executed perfectly. The airtime is strong, the drop is amazing, and the inversions are first class. Because of that, this is easily one of the best wooden coasters I have ever ridden, but it's not the best ride in the park. At number 1 is Raging Bull. This coaster is criminally underrated. It's one of the best B&M hypers out there. The first drop has some of the best airtime I have ever experienced, and the layout after that is just incredible. Every element on this ride is done to complete perfection. The airtime is strong and sustained, and the low to the ground sections are surprisingly forceful for a B&M hyper. It's a roller coaster that I always get off of smiling, and it's hands down one of the best coasters in the park and maybe even the world. But that's it for my list. If you've been to Six Flags Great America, drop a comment down below and tell me what your favorite ride there is.